family's nursing home dream. My parents weren't just building a business. They were building a legacy. I remember the day they first opened Golden Sunset Care, like it was yesterday. My mom, a nurse for 30 years, stood at the front door holding a bouquet of fresh daisies from our garden. My dad, a retired doctor, adjusted the new welcome sign on the porch with a proud smile on his face. It was a cool autumn morning, and the crisp scent of fallen leaves mixed with a faint smell of fresh paint. "We're ready," Dad said, his hand resting on Mom's shoulder. The house had been in our family for decades. It was a modest two-story home in Pinecrest Valley, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and kids rode their bikes to school without fear. My parents had converted it into a small nursing home for elderly residents who needed a little extra care but didn't want to be stuck in a sterile, impersonal facility. They designed every detail to feel like home: cozy quilts, family-style dinners, and game nights around the fireplace. Our first resident was Mrs. Thompson, who had lived on our street for over 40 years. "I didn't want to leave the neighborhood," she told my parents as they helped her move in. "This feels like home." Over the years, Golden Sunset grew to house 8 residents: Mr. Wilson, who played the violin every evening; Mrs. Cooper, who made the best apple pie in town; and Mr. Abernathy, who still flirted with the younger nurses despite being 89 years old. My parents poured their hearts into this place. It wasn't just a business, it was family. Then the HOA started sending letters. I was visiting one afternoon when my mom handed me the first one, a crisp white envelope, gold HOA seal in the corner. "They'll try to kick us out again," Mom whispered, her hands trembling. I tore it open and scanned the contents. It was laced with legal jargon, but the message was clear: cease all business operations within 30 days or face legal action. "They can't do this," I said, looking up at her. "You have permits." "We thought we did," Dad said, walking in from the sunroom. His face was creased with worry. "But Mrs. Jenkins doesn't care about permits." Mrs. Jenkins, head of the HOA, a bitter woman with the personality of cold steel. Her house was across the street, where she maintained a perfect lawn and an army of garden gnomes that seemed to watch you as you passed by. And the worst part? Her son, Derek, owned a massive elder care chain 2 towns over, charging triple what my parents did. He had tried to buy the property before. My parents refused every time. Now it seemed like they weren't taking no for an answer. "I'll handle this," I promised. As a paralegal at Thompson and Hart, I had some legal knowledge. Maybe not enough to take down a whole HOA, but enough to buy us time. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end with just a few letters. It started small. A $50 fine for a flower bed encroaching 2 inches over the property line. A $100 penalty for excessive noise when Mr. Wilson's violin could barely be heard beyond the porch. Then it escalated. An inspector showed up and measured the grass height. "A 1/4 inch too high," he declared, handing me a fine. Another came to check the bird feeder. 2 inches too low, he said, writing it down. I watched through the front window one morning as Mrs. Jenkins' son Derek pulled up in his shiny black BMW. He stepped out, sunglasses gleaming in the sun, and smirked toward the house before walking across the street to his mother's place. "I don't like this," I told Dad as we sat on the front porch. "Neither do I," he said. "But we have permits. They can't do anything." Except they could. A week later, an HOA letter arrived claiming that Mr. Wilson's wheelchair ramp was an unapproved structural addition. Another $500 fine. Then came the letter about the oxygen tank delivery for Mr. Abernathy. The delivery company left the box on the porch for an hour. Improper waste disposal, the letter claimed. Another fine. "We can't keep paying these," Mom said, her voice breaking. "We'll go bankrupt." That's when I realized this wasn't about neighborhood rules. This was personal. I decided to confront Mrs. Jenkins directly. I walked across the street and knocked on her pristine white door. Her garden gnome seemed to glare at me as I stood there. She opened the door, her face hard. "Jennifer," she said, "Cooley, what can I do for you?" "We need to talk about the fines," I said. "And the letter. Your business is disrupting the neighborhood. she replied. Property values have dropped. Dropped? I scoffed. Our house is immaculate. We have permits. Her smile sharpened. Permits don't change the board decision. The board, 7 people, all handpicked by Mrs. Jenkins. As I turned to leave, I saw Derek sitting in the living room behind her, his phone in hand. He glanced at me and smirked. That night, I started digging. Old property records, meeting minutes, HOA rulings. Hours later, I found it, a zoning map from 1973. It showed our property was zoned differently than the others. Multifamily use. This is a grandfather clause. Tanya said when I showed her the next day. They can't legally evict you. But they're trying it anyway, I said. Tanya's eyes narrowed. This smells like corruption. Armed with a zoning map, Tanya and I prepared for the next HOA meeting. I presented the documents to the board, along with letters from neighbors supporting the nursing home. Mrs. Jenkins barely glanced at them. The board has already voted, she announced before I even finished. Golden Sunset Care is in violation of neighborhood covenants. You have 30 days to shut down. You can't just decide that. I shot back. We have legal standing. Mrs. Jenkins smiled thinly. Take it up with the county. Then the fines increased. $1,000 for unauthorized business activity. $2,500 for safety concerns. It was financial warfare. Then Derek showed up with an offer. We'll buy the property for 20% above market value. My parents almost took it. They were exhausted, defeated. Give me one more shot. I begged them. I never got that shot. It was dawn when I heard the grinding of heavy machinery. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. A massive yellow wrecking ball was rolling down the street. No! I screamed. By the time I got outside, the wrecking ball had already swung to the front wall. Plaster and would exploded across the yard. Elderly residents stood in their pajamas, some crying, others clutching each other for support. Mrs. Jenkins stood behind a barricade, clipboard in hand. Derek watched from his BMW, arms crossed, smiling. They can't do this. I shouted at the demolition crew. They have a court order, one of the workers said. Let me see it. Mrs. Jenkins handed me a folder. This isn't a demolition order. I yelled. It's a nuisance complaint. The wrecking ball swung again, taking out the kitchen. Mrs. Cooper's teapot shattered across the garden. I turned to Derek. You did this. He smiled. Just business. My hands curled into fists. I was done playing by the rules. It was time to break them. The aftermath of the destruction was swift and brutal. By noon, the wreckage of Golden Sunset Care had been reduced to a barren lot. The wrecking crew had cleared the debris with surgical precision, leaving behind nothing but dirt and the outline of where the foundation used to be. I stood at the edge of the lot, my fists curled at my sides. Mrs. Jenkins arrived just as the last dump truck pulled away. Derek was beside her, looking far too pleased with himself. Well, Mrs. Jenkins said, her smile cold, at least we can all move on now. You have no legal right to do this. I shot back. The court order said otherwise. That court order was fake, and you know it. Take it up with the county, she said, her smile widening. Derek adjusted his sunglasses. Honestly, you're better off. The place was a dump anyway. I took a step toward him. Tanya caught my arm before I could close the distance. Not here, she whispered. Not yet. Mrs. Jenkins handed me a crisp white envelope. What's this? I demanded. The bill for the demolition, she said. $188,000. Payment due within 30 days. My jaw tightened. You expect us to pay for you destroying our home? It's standard procedure, Mrs. Jenkins said. Failure to pay will result in property seizure. Tanya stepped forward. That's illegal. Feel free to challenge it in court, Mrs. Jenkins replied smoothly. But I wouldn't waste your time. She turned and walked away, Derek following behind her. He paused to give me a mock salute before climbing into his BMW. I watched them drive away, my heart pounding. We have to hit them harder, I said. Tanya's eyes sharpened. Then we need more than suspicion. We need proof. The residents were scattered. Mr. Wilson was staying with his son in a cramped apartment. Mrs. Cooper had been moved to a facility on the outskirts of town. Mr. Abernathy had no family, so he was stuck in a temporary shelter. Mrs. Thompson was in a small room at a community center, sitting in a plastic chair beneath flickering fluorescent lights. I visited her that evening. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," I said, sitting beside her. Her face lit up for a brief second, then her smile faded. "Do you know when we can go home?" I hesitated. "Soon," I lied. "I miss my window," she said softly. "I used to sit there and watch the birds." I squeezed her hand. "We're working on it." She smiled faintly. "Your parents built something special, dear. Don't let them take that away." Tanya called me as I was leaving. "I have news," she said. "What kind of news?" "The kind that might change everything." We met at her apartment that night. Tanya's dining table was covered in papers, zoning maps, and old meeting minutes. A laptop sat open, audio files playing on low volume. "What is this?" I asked. Tanya pulled out a flash drive. This came from Mr. Rodriguez. He was on the HOA board until last year. Why'd he quit? "Because of this." She clicked a file. The tinny sound of a recorded conversation filled the room. "We need to get that nursing home out of the neighborhood," Mrs. Jenkins' voice said. "That might be tricky," another voice, Derek, replied. "We'll figure it out," Mrs. Jenkins said. "You'll get your expansion. Just make sure the money is there." Tanya clicked stop. "There's more," she said. She pulled out a document with highlighted sections. "These are financial transfers from Derek's business to the HOA account," Tanya said. "Thousands of dollars. And it gets better." She handed me another paper. "This is a purchase agreement," she said. "Derek's company was set to buy your parents' property for 20% over market value after the demolition. So this was never about zoning." I said slowly. Tanya nodded. "It was about business. Derek's business." "That's conflict of interest," I said. "It's worse than that," Tanya replied. "It's fraud." My pulse quickened. "We need to take this to the police." Tanya shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "We need more." We got lucky the next day. Mrs. Thompson's daughter had installed a security camera at their house a year ago. It was still running. It captured the night before the demolition. Tanya and I watched the footage in stunned silence. Mrs. Jenkins was in the HOA parking lot, wearing a dark coat. Derek pulled up in his black BMW. He got out, holding a large envelope. He handed it to Mrs. Jenkins. She opened it, looked inside, and smiled. Then they shook hands. "You think that's cash?" I asked. Tanya's mouth curled into a smile. "Does it matter?" She pulled out her phone. "I have a friend at Channel 7. "No," I said. Tanya raised an eyebrow. "No." I stood, my hands curled into fists. "We're not going to the media." "Why not?" "Because I'm not finished yet. I can file a corruption case tomorrow," Tanya said. "Not yet." She crossed her arms. "What are you planning?" I thought about the bulldozers sitting in the storage unit. Something permanent. Tanya's eyes narrowed. "I'm serious," she said. "We have enough to take them down legally. But will it stop them?" "Eventually." "Not good enough," I said. Tanya sighed. "You know what you're risking?" "I know." "Then I'll back you," she said. "But you'd better be sure." I smiled grimly. I've never been more sure of anything. I spent the next night making calls. A friend of mine worked for a construction company. He owed me a favor. I told him I needed equipment. No questions asked. "Just give me 2 hours," I said. "Done," he replied. The following night, I drove the bulldozer back to the HOA office. Tanya texted me just as I arrived. "They're filing more paperwork to block your parents' rebuild permit. Also, Derek just bought the property next door." That was it. I tightened my grip on the bulldozer's controls. Not anymore. 2 days after Derek's arrest, a certified letter arrived at our doorstep. My mom found it first. "What now?" she muttered as she handed me the envelope. The HOA seal was stamped in gold at the top of the letter. I ripped it open and scanned the contents. My blood ran cold. Notice of financial claim. Pinecrest Valley HOA seeks restitution for damages resulting from unauthorized demolition and property modification. My mom's face paled. They're suing us? Not just suing us, I said, handing her the letter. They're claiming we caused the damage to the HOA office, and they want $250,000. Mom's hand shook as she gripped the paper. We don't have that kind of money. They know that, I said darkly. Tanya was at the house within the hour, her legal pad already out. They have no case, Tanya said after reading the letter. The building was on county land, and the demolition was ruled an accident. Then why would they bother? I asked. Tanya's jaw tightened. Because they're trying to bleed you out. It's a pressure move. They know you'll have to spend thousands to defend yourselves. And if we can't, they'll take the house, Tanya said. I stood and walked toward the window, my fists tightening. Across the street, Mrs. Jenkins' house sat dark and empty. Derek might have been in jail, but Mrs. Jenkins was still pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They're not going to win, I said. Tanya raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time to go on offense. I didn't have to think long about how to strike back. Mrs. Jenkins had always used the HOA office as her personal war room, a place where she could intimidate homeowners and enforce her tyrannical rules. The office was gone now, but the HOA's infrastructure, the fines, the property restrictions, the intimidation, was still intact. Until I found the flaw. I spent 2 days at the county records office, digging through land records, zoning permits, and property lines. Tanya sat beside me, helping highlight key details. There, Tanya said, pointing at an old document. This plot line. See how it cuts 6 feet into HOA land? I leaned in. That's county land. Exactly. If the HOA building was sitting on county land, it was never legally theirs, Tanya said. I grinned. So, technically, the HOA office wasn't destroyed illegally, Tanya finished. My pulse quickened. And if they built it on land they didn't own? They owe you damages, Tanya said, smiling. We drove straight to the county office. It took less than an hour to file the claim. The county clerk raised her eyebrows when she saw the paperwork. They built 6 feet over the line? She asked. Yep, Tanya said. Well, the clerk said, stamping the forms, that makes things interesting. By the next morning, news broke that Pinecrest Valley's HOA had been using county land illegally for over a decade, and they owed back taxes. A lot of back taxes. The HOA's bank account was frozen. Mrs. Jenkins had disappeared from public view. And Derek? He was still in jail, facing multiple charges for fraud and elder abuse. But I wasn't finished yet. The fallout hit like a wrecking ball. Channel 7 ran a special segment on the corruption scandal. Old board members came forward with stories of intimidation and bribery. Former homeowners who had been bullied into paying outrageous fines started sharing their experiences online. A local journalist reached out to me directly. We'd love to interview you, she said over the phone. No thanks, I replied. She hesitated. You don't want to speak out? I smiled. I already did. At the next town hall meeting, the room was packed. Homeowners filled every seat, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Thompson, the new HOA president, stood at the front. He cleared his throat. As you all know, he said, recent events have led to changes within the HOA leadership. An elderly man raised his hand. What happens to the fines we paid? They will be refunded, Mr. Thompson said, and future fines will be subject to public approval. A wave of relief swept through the room. Another resident stood. What about the HOA fees? Cut in half, Mr. Thompson said. Applause broke out. And the Jenkins family? Another resident asked. Removed from the board, Mr. Thompson said. Permanently. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Tanya gave me a sideways smile. Feels good, doesn't it? She whispered. Yeah, I said. It does. A week later, the court ruled in our favor. The HOA had no legal standing to sue us over the office destruction. They had built on county land without a permit. Mrs. Jenkins was forced to sell her house to cover the HOA's legal costs. Derek's trial was quick. The evidence of bribery and elder abuse was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Mrs. Jenkins cut a deal, pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud and corruption. She avoided prison time, but lost everything. Golden Sunset Care was rebuilt within 6 months, fully funded by the county as part of the settlement. But the best part came the following spring. Tanya and I stood in the garden behind the new nursing home, watching Mr. Wilson play his violin beneath the cherry blossom tree. Mrs. Cooper sat nearby, sipping tea. Mrs. Thompson smiled from her usual spot by the window. "This is how it was supposed to be," I said. "You did it," Tanya said. "No," I replied. "We did it." 3 months after the rebuild, the mayor hosted a dedication ceremony for Golden Sunset Care. "We are proud," the mayor said, "to honor the work of Dr. and Mrs. Reynolds, whose commitment to this community has given us all a stronger future." The mayor handed Dad a plaque. "Golden Sunset Care is more than a nursing home," the mayor said. "It's a symbol of what happens when good people refuse to back down." Mom wiped tears from her eyes as Dad smiled proudly. After the ceremony, I sat with Tanya on the front steps. "So what now?" Tanya asked. I looked around at the new building, the freshly planted flowers, the residents laughing and talking together. "I think we're finally home," I said. "You don't feel like starting trouble?" Tanya teased. I smiled. "Not today." Mr. Wilson's son approached. "I heard about Derek's facility," he said. "They're turning it into affordable senior housing." I raised an eyebrow. "And who's running it?" He smiled. "You, if you want it." Tanya's mouth dropped open. "Jennifer," she said, "you're not seriously considering this?" I grinned. "Why not?" She laughed. "You're dangerous." "You have no idea," I replied. I stood and walked toward the entrance of Golden Sunset Care as the evening sun washed over front steps. Sometimes justice takes a wrecking ball. Sometimes it just takes knowing where to strike.